Hey everyone, Gavin Brooks here, excited to talk about the release today of my 5th EP in a row this summer. It's been a very busy summer, new music almost every Friday. I was supposed to release this last Friday and it was just too much. My life was going crazy. I was feeling so stressed out. I was like, can I finish this thing in the way I need it to be done? The answer was no. So I gave myself one more week, and sure enough, we're here a week later, and we have the 5th project called Ruiqan. As always, there's links in the description. Go check it out and listen to it. Ruiqan is the most recent project of all these releases, so it feels the most new and relevant for me personally. But it is an indulgent push in the direction of doomy, depressive atmosphere. It was made at a time where I was frankly kind of sick of everything and sick of music in particular. Really, I've spent most of my time this year either teaching guitar, playing and practicing guitar, or working on recording projects or writing music. And so when you're doing these things all the time, sometimes you can get a little crazy from, thinking about the minute details of music all the time. Sometimes things become so familiar too that you crave something that doesn't exist. Those things I was looking for that I was wanting to hear was a project that was leaning into the extremity of slowness, but had a lot of dedicated negative space. So I wanted pauses built into the riff, not just a pause here and there for dramatic effect, but like there's blank space written into the sections. It's part of what you remember as the listener. I had such a clear vision right away of what I wanted the production to be like. Before anything was written or recorded, I thought, it's got to be super dry and loud and upfront and in your face. I want there to be a snare with so much character that you hear the ring of it bleeding through the emptiness. So whenever there is a pause, you just hear that snare ringing through. And then the last main feature of this project is that the vocals express more of like a quiet rage and despair. So rather than doing a project with more harsh vocals in a traditional metal style, I wanted to do something here that reflected how I was feeling, which was kind of a rage and a despair that is listless. It's not extreme in the loudness, it's extreme in the quietness and how close it is to silence. The vocals really are coming from a place of having so little energy and not wanting to talk. I thought it would be a cool contrast to have like loud metal tone guitar, big fat drums, super pissed off distorted bass, all really up in your face, and then somehow you're also hearing, fighting through the mix, this like depressed quiet voice as if someone's whispering in your ear. And it was quite difficult to mix, but in the end, I'm so stoked and happy with the result. This idea came about in January when I was already in the weeds with trying to finish and mix Lostforest and Unknown Secret. And I became sort of acutely aware at that time of how important it was to just go at a project full force while it's exciting. So everything in this project that I provided in terms of like instruments was written and recorded in really like a week or two, where it was just, that was all I was doing besides work. I got all the writing out of my system right then when it felt accurate, when it felt like this is exactly the type of music that I wanted to hear. But you may be wondering, okay, if this all happened in January, why did it take so long to release? And the reason for that is drums. There was one drummer I initially was bugging a lot and was like, hey, could you please record drums for me? We've been wanting to work together. I've programmed all the drums in MIDI, but I need them to be real, and you seem to have means to record. I was going on this big trip in February, and I was like, please, can you get this done before the trip? It just didn't happen. I came back from my trip. I felt like I'd lost momentum, but I kept bugging him about it. It just didn't work out. He didn't have time, or it didn't make sense. And so I thought, well, why don't I ask Nicholas, who recorded the drums for Lostforest for me? And at that time, Nicholas had heard like one track from Lostforest that was actually sort of finished, so maybe he was starting to earn my trust. And thankfully, Nicholas rose to the occasion. He learned all the parts and did a great performance of them. I think in the end, this project sounds super raw, but the reality of it is that the hits had to be so carefully constructed so that guitars, bass, and like a kick or a snare are all hitting right in that pocket at the same time, that they mesh well together. I had recorded all of my guitar and bass parts to MIDI drums, so when Nicholas sent me his tracks back, even though they were pretty well performed, even like the tiniest deviation from where the MIDI drums was could create some weird kind of flam sounds between the instruments, and we needed this to be like crazy tight. Nicholas also sent me 3 takes of each track, and basically I meticulously searched through each take to find like the most intense hits, so it just sounds loud and intense the whole time. Part of what made this difficult as well was that the snare was kind of changing tuning through different takes. So you'd find a piece of a performance that sounds great in track 4 in the second section, and then you'd want to pair that with something from the third take, but then you'd realize, wait, the snare tunings don't sound the same. So this caused a lot of problems. I spent forever drum editing. It kind of drove me insane. But in the end, I'm so happy I went through the effort of dealing with real drums so that I could have a product that sounds so real and alive, and in the end, infinitely better than the MIDI drums. Drums are just so fucking complicated to get the sound of correct. If you think about like a guitar, it's like, okay, really, we're gonna put this through an amp in a cabinet or a simulation of that, and maybe put 1 or 2 mics in front of it. You EQ it a bit, it's distorted, it doesn't really have dynamics, you don't need to compress it, you just need to get the EQ right. You think about bass, pretty similar, you need some compression now, but it's even easier because you usually just single track it. Vocals are pretty similar, we usually just record with 1 microphone, make sure you have some correct compression and EQ on it. Those are really all the dimensions you're working with. But then drums, you have to have multiple microphones, which are all capturing the same sources that affect each microphone in a different way. Now the compression and EQ is so important, but it makes such a difference whether you're applying it to the snare mic, or to the overheads, or to the kick mic. The craziest thing about mixing drums is that you will do something that makes the snare sound better and it makes the cymbals sound worse. It's like, oh, you brightened up the snare drum, now the hi-hat is bleeding way too fucking loud. The first time I had a chance to mix multi-track drums was in 2014 or 15. In those 10 years, I've probably done it like 15 or 20 times that I've been able to mix multi-track drums, and probably half those times I engineered the recording, and I still feel like I'm figuring it out. There's so much to learn, and there's such an art to recording drums well. It took me so long to get satisfied with the drum sound for this mix. I think even just in this last week here, I got it like 15-20% better in terms of my satisfaction with the way the snare was sounding. This part feels a bit like showing you a dirty room, because basically you can see what a nightmare that this project is. You see I have all up here, first take of drum tracks, the second take, the third take, but then really I've taken bits from the second and third take and put them up into the main track. Down here, we can see we have the DI guitar channels, and then we have the reamped guitar channels, which were kindly reamped by my friend David Scholes, who did a fantastic job. I have to say too, this is like my favorite guitar tone I've ever had on any release of mine. So stoked with the way it turned out. You have the bass track here. Just using the DI with a lot of internal processing, and you'll notice I'm using a similar trick that I did before where I have the main bass signal and then I have a bus it's sent to, which is adding this distorted signal, which is really just about giving that high end a bunch of grit that cuts through. And you can really hear like the clank of that bass every time it's being hit, which I love. There's a band called Muck, which their early 2000s stuff is like very, it's like, to me it's like mature nu metal, but if you listen to a lot of their records, they have this production that feels very like inherently dark and moody, and you hear that clank of the bass. And that's very nu metal. It's like Korn and a lot of that stuff from that era, but it sounds sick. We have the vocal here. My world's alive. Which sounds so wet and processed by itself because it has to sound that way to actually cut through the mix. If we listen to this totally dry for a sec. My world's alive. That's what it sounds like. But if we hear that in context of the mix, you only hear the low end of it. You can't hear it anymore. And you'll notice the drum tracks here look like quite a mess. They really only were 4 tracks, which is kicks, overhead, and snare. There's a few tracks here that are just called like snare layer or kick layer. And what that means is we've reached a certain point in the project where there's so much processing, and maybe this is a bad thing, on the original snare channel, but I also don't want to go back because there's aspects of the processing that I like. So I think let's just bring back in the original signal and mix a little bit of that in. We'd call this like parallel processing, right? When people talk about like parallel compression or parallel EQ, it's like stick a little bit of the original signal back in and just process that. Anyway, this is what the final drum sound is like alone. And let's first compare that to the MIDI drums. MIDI drums sound fine and accurate, but there's no fucking character to them, and you can't hear a snare ring at all, which is integral to this project. But if we listen to the kick, overhead, and snare, how they originally sounded with no processing, check this out. Honestly, I love the way those sound raw. In the end, I'm much more happy with how it sounded in the mix, because if we heard these in the mix, they're dead and they don't cut through. This project doesn't have any toms. Again, it's funny, Lostforest didn't have any toms. That was just Nicholas's doing. And then I programmed the drums for this first, and I just was programming and I was like, nah, dude, toms don't sound dark, dude. I wanted to sound dark and gritty, no toms. So that's how we ended up here. There are a few cool extra elements that occur throughout the project, and one is noise. Originally, the noise patch was a MIDI instrument using a contact sampler. And basically, these are all just noise sounds I made in a separate project. I did a little session where I'm like, okay, let's make some cool noise stuff, and then you bring it back in here so that you can use it as an instrument that you program with MIDI. And I think it actually sounds pretty good right there as MIDI, but what I do with everything right now for this project too, I'm like, make it sound real, make it sound like it came through a speaker. So what do? I reamp it through a speaker, but there are elements of noise all throughout the project. And this is almost also very like early 2000s new metal. If you think about what makes like Slipknot, Self-Titled, and Iowa so cool, there's actual like samples and noise and stuff that those other two dudes were doing or whatever. Even though it's about quiet vocals, there is occasionally a agonizing scream. In here, this is kind of like a Fry type shriek. This is used in the track Abandoned Vein, which I think is one of the coolest tracks because it has this big, dark climax, which is helped with this choir sound that I recorded. You can hear what the choir sounds like here in the session project. And I feel like this move is also borrowing from Muck production. If you listen to their album Kuchiki no To, I think there's quite a few tracks where they do this kind of layered harmony vocal during like a big section. It sounds epic and dark, man. And that's what I want. So here we are in the actual session project where I recorded the choir. You'll notice all I did was I recorded one line. Right? And then I doubled it or tripled it, and they're at different registers. We have a high one, and then we hear there, hell yeah, the bass, which has been quad tracked. And you see here we just have a bit of pitch correction with a very slow response time, 500 milliseconds. It's hardly really affecting it, but the idea is just kind of keeping things in check, generally in tune. And we have Waves Vocal Rider, which sounds a little better than different than compression. It sounds like moving a fader up and down. It just kind of evens out the quiet bits. Super cool, super cool. Something I want to show you that I haven't shown you really with any of the projects so far is what the mastering project file looks like. It can be very helpful to take your track out of your session project and just listen and think, okay, could there be any changes made to this that help the overall sound of it? Like you see here, I did a very small dip of needing less sort of low mids. And I got to this conclusion too by constantly referencing it between 3 or 4 different sound sources. I would listen to the mixes on these headphones that I've had for like 13 years, I know so well, on the Apple EarPod headphones that I listen to on all the time, and my 8-inch M audio monitors that I've also had for like 10 years. Because they all have slightly different frequency response. You will make a change and go, oh, okay, this is sounding good here, but now it's sounding too boxy in my earbuds, or it's sounding too shrill in my speakers. It's really hard to find a spot where you're happy with it everywhere. So a change like this came from kind of feeling like it was almost there, but it did sound a bit too boxy on headphones specifically. We have a few instances of ozone, which I'm really only using for multi-band compression. And really the idea of this is just controlling some crazy snare hits. So if we see here, you can see usually it's not being activated. The first snare hit didn't catch it. The second snare hit went a little too loud in this frequency range. And this is just one of those things that really helps that you can actually do in the final stage. I've already done lots of processing to the snare channel, to the drum bus, but sometimes you find when all the instruments come together, like maybe at that moment the bass is also hitting and it boosts that frequency a bit. So there's the math of how everything works together that sometimes creates imbalances where a certain moment might be too loud in a certain frequency. So that's what those plugins are there for. A bit of master compression. Just about 1 or 2 dBs, and then simply a limiter. You can see I'm not really pushing it at all. We just have a few dB at most of gain reduction. When you mix something to be very loud, like you compress it a lot at the source, you don't need to limit it hard at the end. It's already loud. And I think that's what people don't understand sometimes about records that are made well, that are very loud, are just mixed to be very loud. It's not like they've just been slammed through a limiter at the end. And then what you'll notice that's interesting here is that this shit looks so chopped up. Like, look at this. And part of that is because you notice things you don't like and you want to keep the rest of the track exactly the same. And I think, okay, let me just go back and grab a version of this section that doesn't have that click that I heard or whatever. In my pre-master files, I have my core pre-masters of the tracks, and then I have all these little edits, right? So you'll notice like track 1 outro reverb. So what that actually means is the last bit of track 1 is using a version with a ton of a plate reverb on it. So it just exactly cuts in for that moment, having the reverb there, and I don't have to automate it or worry about it fading out correctly. Sometimes that can be buggy. I just cut it right in. You can see things like this called rim hiss, tireless fix, snare fix, bass reverb fix. All these things are done because I heard something I didn't like, bring it back into this session file. I can make sure nothing else has been changed, because sometimes with really intensive projects like this with lots of processing, when you export them, you get bugs, or sometimes things can react a little differently, unfortunately. And what you'll notice sometimes is that I take a piece of the track and cut it away from the main track. Like here, for example, the original way it sounds has too much low end. Like I need the low end in the vocal when it's in the mix, but when it's out of the mix, I don't need it. So here I have cut it out. So the vocal sounds a little more fragile when it's on its own. And then the other thing I do in all my projects, good little secret, is I add these boosts, which just means I literally copy over a tiny piece of that moment to another track, so that basically I am increasing the volume just for that section. It's just a little more precise than using automation to boost it, because I'm getting it to start exactly where like the transient of the snare is. And you do that when you listen through and you think, ah, okay, that snare hit's kind of weak. So it's like, okay, let's give them some help by adding that to the signal, right? So without it, it's subtle. With it, and if you can't hear that, it's because you haven't been working on music all day. I can't super hear that right now, but when I'm working on music all day, you start to notice it. And then here we are in the final project, where we just make sure there's still no more little errors, and that the distance between each track is correct in terms of like silence and flow on the release. I literally have to go teach guitar right now. I'm already 2 minutes late. Definitely go take a listen to this and check out the previous 4 projects: Lostforest, Unknown Secret, Bleeding Light Energy, and Vixen Aquatic. Today was EP number 5. Next Friday, the last final one, the oldest EP of all, and surely one that I don't think anyone can predict the style of. Thank you for watching this whole video, and have a great day.